Well, good morning, shipmates. You know, I've never been introduced by an admiral before. It's rather humbling. Thank you very much, Bruce. Bruce's introduction lifts up my spirits. Introductions often do that. But sometimes, you know, your spirits can be lifted up, then be let down. At the end of last semester at university, I was reading my student course evaluations. And I came across one. And this student checked all the right blocks. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Once in a while, good. And then I got to the comments section. And the student wrote, if I only had 1 hour left on Earth, I would want to spend it in Professor Fowler's class. And then I turned the page. The student continued writing, because Professor Fowler's classes last for eternity. So I will try to keep you for some time less than eternity. In the 19th century, the antebellum period, the United States Navy was the darling of the Republic. It had served the nation well. Edward Preble, Constitution, Barbary pirates, Tripoli, suing for peace, gave great note to the Navy. And then in the War of 1812, while the United States Army had a somewhat, shall we say, lackluster experience in that war, the Navy brought it glory in several single-ship combats, which the great frigates, American frigates, a few fur-built frigates, as the British refer to them, bested the Royal Navy. It came out of that war with great heroes, posters celebrating the accomplishments of the Navy. In the period after the War of 1812, the Navy turns its attention to suppressing piracy in the West Indies. Captain Porter. And here again, the Navy distinguished itself. It became the heroes, the heroines of the American nation, this expanding, growing republic. The Navy's principal missions in the antebellum period were quite simple. It was to protect American trade. American merchant marine, of course, was expanding at a rapid rate in the antebellum period and required protection in far distant places, such as in the East Indies at Kuala Batu. Here, local natives had distressed attacked an American merchant ship, and an American frigate was sent to punish those natives. An event not unusual for the American Navy, nor for the other European navies as well, as they sought trade in these far distant waters. So protecting trade was of great importance. Naval officers also in the antebellum period were the principal diplomatic officers. These were men who were in far distant ports where there were no American consuls, no American ministers, and so Navy officers played a critical role in representing the United States in these distant places. And perhaps most romantic, and certainly most dramatic, the United States Navy in the antebellum period was the principal agent of exploration. One of the greatest exploring expeditions in history, conducted by Commander Charles Wilkes, this Navy exploring expedition of the Pacific and the Antarctic. And this is the expedition, by the way, that brought back thousands of specimens from the far distant regions of the Pacific. Those specimens became the heart of the newly formed Smithsonian Institution. And so the Navy then in this antebellum period had a rising reputation for bravery, for exploration, intellectual activity, and for opening new ports. It was, of course, Commodore Matthew Calgrave Perry opened Japan to American commerce. So all of these events then put the Navy in great standings in the American public. And then came the critical years leading up to the American Civil War. Under the administration of President Buchanan, a Democrat with strong Southern sympathies, when the crisis came with the election of Abraham Lincoln, President Buchanan did nothing. One can speculate about what his sympathies steered him towards. Southern sympathies, and those sympathies were also evinced by his Secretary of the Navy, Isaac Toucey. Toucey was a Democrat from Connecticut, but he shared Buchanan's Southern sympathies. And in the midst of a great crisis, when the Union was literally falling apart, the secession of South Carolina was a sign of things to come. The administration did nothing either for the Army or for the Navy to prepare for the coming crisis. Indeed, this shows the disposition of the United States fleet on the eve of the Civil War. As you can see, there are 12 vessels in the home fleet, 12 vessels in the home fleet. In the East Indies, 7 vessels. In the Mediterranean, 3 vessels. At the Brazil station, South Atlantic, 3 vessels. On the African coast, slave patrol, 8 vessels. And in the Pacific, 7 vessels. The home fleet, consisting of 12 vessels, was here in native waters. Buchanan and Toucey did nothing to recall any of his distant fleets. They were kept at a distance and not called home in this time of crisis, leaving the Navy initially then, as we tumbled towards war, unprepared. And war came, of course. When the Confederates fired here in Charleston, South Carolina, the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter. Charleston, of course, was the hotbed, as South Carolina was, the hotbed of secession. And it was no surprise that Fort Sumter would be fired upon. The Confederates demanded its surrender, the Union refused to surrender, and the fort again was attacked by the Confederates. It was not a long battle. Fort Sumter had a very small garrison. She was completely unable to defend herself, surrounded there in the harbor by Confederate gun batteries. Major Anderson, the Union commander, put up a defense, but it was only a symbolic defense, really. And within a day, less than a day actually, Fort Sumter surrendered. The Civil War had begun. As the Civil War began, the Union needed to consider its strategy. Initially, the war, of course, would be a short war. Everyone, 75,000 volunteers called up by Lincoln, would be enough to subdue the Confederacy. No need to think about a long war, but it indeed would be a long war. And one of the principal concerns, of course, was the Confederates' relationship with foreign powers. It was imperative if the Confederacy was to survive, to get recognition and assistance from foreign powers, which meant one of the Union's tasks would be to prevent that from happening, to seal off the Confederacy, not only for diplomatic reasons, but obviously for material reasons as well. The then senior general in the Army, General Winfield Scott. Scott had been in the Army since the War of 1812. He was known as Old Fuss and Feathers. Fuss and Feathers because he loved fancy uniforms. General Scott proposed to seal off the Confederacy with a blockade. His strategy was to blockade the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, to then attack from the north, from Ohio, from the Midwest, and drive south along the Mississippi, crushing the Confederacy. Scott's plan became known as the Anaconda Plan. That is this giant South American snake that would surround the Confederacy and squeeze it to death. Scott's plan was derided. It would take too long. The war needs to be ended soon. Scott's plan provided for a long squeezing, deprivation of the South. And the Union was not ready for that. Of course, General Scott turned out to be prescient in terms of how the war would be won. It would be won by blockade. This is a statement from the Declaration of Paris, 1856, an international conference that set down certain rules for maritime warfare. The United States did not participate in the Declaration of Paris, but it was an expression of international law that other nations regarded and respected. And in regard to blockade, the Declaration of Paris said, quote, blockades to be binding must be effective that is, maintained by a force really sufficient to prevent access to the enemy's coast. That is to say, it was not sufficient in international law to simply proclaim a blockade. The blockade had to be effective. And so the Union's task then was to initiate an effective blockade. And that declaration came on April 19, 1861, when the blockade declaration was issued by President Lincoln. The issue of a blockade declaration meant, and this became somewhat of a diplomatic tango, meant that the Union was recognizing the South as a belligerent, which meant now that other nations would do the same. And within a short time of the declaration of this blockade, other nations, France and England in particular, recognized the belligerent status of the Confederacy, which gave the Confederacy some standing, not a standing as an independent nation necessarily, but it gave standing then that there was a war going on, and that therefore the Confederate ships deserved the respect of a nation at war. This was a state of belligerency. Having proclaimed the blockade, now became the task of instituting it. They formed, the president appointed a blockade board. These were 4 men who were charged with designing the blockade. The chairman of the board was Francis DuPont, Francis I. DuPont. He chaired the board. He was assisted by the Coast Survey, Disposition Coast Survey, Admiral Davis, and Chief of Army Engineers, General Barney. So these 4 men then met frequently in the early days now to lay out the plan for an effective blockade of the thousands of miles of the southern coast. This is the federal blockade. It was divided into four sections. And as you can see here, it went from Virginia, from Norfolk, Virginia, roughly, all along the Atlantic coast into the Gulf. And these were the various squadrons that were assigned to blockade the southern ports. It was difficult. As was previously mentioned, at the opening of the war, there were less than 50 ships in the United States Navy. It meant acquiring more ships, and in particular, it meant acquiring certain kinds of vessels. The squadrons that I showed you a moment ago, those 42-some ships that were dispersed throughout the world, were fairly large vessels, steam frigates, side-wheelers, not screw-driven. They were deep draft vessels, and they were not particularly useful for blockade, close inshore blockade of Confederate ports. They simply took too much water. So not only did the Union have to find more ships, many more ships, but they also had to find ships that were suitable for this blockade duty. They chartered a number of vessels. This is a typical kind of sidewheel steamer. It was a merchant vessel that the Union chartered. They chartered, by the end of the war, hundreds of these vessels from private owners. Now, the blockade itself has often been somewhat in dispute as to its effectiveness in defeating the Confederacy. Now, these numbers are a little difficult to see, but let me just take a moment to take you through them. These are the blockade statistics. I know statistics can tell you almost anything you want to tell you. But here are some numbers. 1861, 71 steamers attempted to break the blockade to get to Confederate ports. The Union was able to stop 4 out of 71. That's a 6% success rate. 1862, 86 vessels attempted to run the blockade. 51 were captured. It was a better year. 59% of those attempted were captured. 1863, 118 vessels attempted to run the blockade. 74 were captured for a capture rate of 62%. pretty good. 1864, 127 vessels ran the blockade. 76 were captured or destroyed, a rate of 60% capture. And in 1865, to be sure, a truncated year, 50 vessels attempted the passage, 18 were captured, 36% capture rate. Now, on the face of this doesn't look like a very good record. But these statistics misrepresent the effectiveness of the Union blockade. In the pre-war period, 71 vessels would be nothing. In the ports of Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans. New Orleans is one of the world's great ports. In any one year, thousands of vessels would have entered and cleared. And so what we have here is a little bit misleading when people tell you the effectiveness or the lack of the effectiveness of the blockade. The real effectiveness of the blockade was not in the ships captured or destroyed. It was in the ships that never came. The Union blockade was successful in preventing those thousands of ships in peacetime, which might have been trading in and out of southern ports, to even attempt it. So, despite these disappointing statistics, the fact is the Union blockade was successful in preventing those thousands of vessels from attempting to make it to Confederate ports. The men in charge of naval strategy on either side of the war, Gideon Welles from Connecticut, Hartford, Connecticut, and Stephen Mallory from Florida. Both men had naval experience. That is to say that Gideon Welles had served in the Navy Department in the 1840s, and Stephen Mallory, senator from Florida, had been chairman of the Senate Naval Committee just before the war. So both men had a knowledge of naval strategy. They were not innocent men. They both understood the importance of naval strategy. The fundamental point was Welles understood the importance of the blockade, and Mallory understood the importance of breaking the blockade. Blockades are difficult, particularly in an age of the technology, steam, and sail. They're very difficult to keep up. You have to contest against winds, currents, tides, darkness. They are very, very difficult. And in the end, the only really effective way to complete a blockade is to seize the enemy's ports, to completely blockade it. And very early in the war, the Union Navy began their attack on what were called the Hatteras Islands, the outer islands. And here you see the Union, an amphibious force, one of the first major amphibious attacks, the Union launching an attack on the Hatteras forts, capturing those forts in the outer rim of North Carolina, where there were so many numerous shoals and small bays and creeks that made it difficult to blockade. And so they go ashore and manage to take these forts, thereby closing off those entry points for the Confederacy. The other ships that were offshore weren't doing quite so well. The blockade, the offshore blockade, for trying to blockade particularly places like Savannah and Charleston, South Carolina, were something of an embarrassment. Now, this is a cartoon that appeared in the Union newspaper. And what it says is the blockade on the Connecticut Plan. And this is a farce. Here you have the Cambridge and the Gostock, two Union blockading vessels, and they are wash tubs, which is exactly how they were portrayed, ineffective wash tubs. And there in the distance you see, waving goodbye, is the Confederate raider Nashville. Well, she has just managed very easily to get by the Union blockade. So from the very beginning then, the blockade was seen as not always terribly effective. And every time a Confederate raider or blockade runner made it in or out was a moment of embarrassment for the Union Navy. In their attempt to capture the ports, to seize and to seal up the Confederacy, no port, no place was more important to the Union than Charleston, South Carolina. In fact, the Union Navy had an obsession with Charleston, South Carolina. That obsession had begun with the surrender of Fort Sumter, when the Navy had been actually driven off. They wanted Charleston back. And Charleston, as I mentioned, was the seat of the Confederacy, hotbed of secession. And so Charleston becomes the target for the Union Navy. And here you see an attack on the Charleston forts. The Navy developed a system of attacking forts. In the 18th century, in the Age of Sail, it was said that a ship's a fool to fight a fort. A ship's a fool to fight a fort. The reason for that is forts are stone, whatever they are, they're strong, they're resistant, and you had wooden warships, victims, prisoners of the wind, trying to bombard a fort. The ships were always quite vulnerable. In the Civil War, that changes. And it changes because of a strategy that the Union Navy adopted with steam propulsion. These are wooden ships, steam propelled, some would sail, but mostly steam propelled. And what they would do is that they would circle in an ellipse opposite a fort. And so there would be a continuous, now that they could control their mobility, there would be a continuous round of fire. The ships would come around, fire their broadsides, and then continue around, repair and reload, and then come back and fire another broadside. So that they were now able to keep up a continuous fire, from their moving vessels, a continuous fire on fortifications ashore. The challenge in South Carolina, however, was that these forts were often made up of palmetto logs, which are soft and spongy. And what would happen is that the Union shot, for the most part, despite this pain, for the most part, solid shot, would simply just melt into the palmetto logs, did very little damage. But it was now possible to keep up this continuous fire. The breaking of the blockade became the aim of Stephen Mallory. The Confederacy had a very weak industrial base. They did not have the capacity to build large ships. They did not have the capacity to build steam machinery. And so they had to find other ways. They could not challenge the Union Navy on the water, but they could manage another way to challenge it. Only a few days after Fort Sumter, and a rather pusillanimous day, the Union Navy abandoned Gosport, the Navy post at Norfolk. Just abandoned it, walked away. As they walked away, they scuttled the ships that were there. Some they were able to take away, others they were not. One of the vessels that they scuttled was the frigate Merrimack, USS Merrimack, a rather new steam frigate. An inept sabotage put her in the water, but it didn't do anything to destroy her machinery, which was vital. And so the Confederacy very quickly salvaged Merrimack and brought her up and would convert her, here she is in the dry dock at Gosport, and they would convert her into an ironclad. Ironclads were not new. They were not invented in the Civil War. The British and French had both experimented with ironclads, not to any great degree. There were a number of technical and engineering difficulties with them. And so the idea of an ironclad did not originate with the Confederacy or with the Union. It did not originate with Mallory or with Wells. But they're the first to build ironclads that will actually engage in combat against one another. The Merrimack was raised, and she was clad with iron. Not easy for the Confederacy to do because they didn't have much iron. They would often use railroad rails, put them and melt them down and use them for armament. The guns were installed on broadside. So this, in many ways, is a rather conventional looking vessel. She doesn't have sails, she's steam-powered ironclad, but the guns are mounted along the side. She was ready now to go out into Hampton Roads to break the Union blockade. She steamed out, a powerful vessel but weakly propelled. And this was one of the problems of ironclads. The propulsion machinery was not always capable of moving this very heavy object. But nonetheless, she came out and wreaked havoc on the wooden Union frigates that were blockading Hampton Roads. Wreaked havoc. The Union now was in peril. The blockade was in peril. But not really. John Ericsson, this man, a Swedish inventor. Ericsson was an ingenious fellow. Ericsson was the man who brought in practical steam screw propulsion. I say practical, steam screw propulsion for the American Navy. He tried out the steam propulsion the Navy did on the USS Princeton. She was the first steam-propelled propeller-driven, screw-driven U.S. Navy vessel. She was brought up at the Potomac for a demonstration, not just of her steam propulsion, but a demonstration of a new gun, a very large caliber gun called the Peacemaker, to demonstrate the weapon's power. Well, the weapon demonstrated its power by blowing up, injuring and killing several people aboard the Princeton. It was a disaster, a complete disaster. And while Erickson had not been in charge, had not been involved in designing the weapon, he had been involved in obviously designing the vessel. And for the moment, the United States Navy sort of stepped back from screw propulsion. They simply stepped back. There was a moment of caution here, caution. But Erickson reappears now in the early days of the Civil War, when it's realized that the Confederates are building an ironclad. That certainly was no secret. And how would the Navy respond? The Navy and President Lincoln were presented with a number of different proposals as to how to do this. Erickson's proposal was radical, very different. It wasn't on the style of the Merrimack, now known as the CSS Virginia. It was on a different style. Erickson proposed to build what essentially was a raft with a turret in the middle, with two guns in it that would revolve. It was an incredibly imaginative design. The conventional naval officers were very, very skeptical. Lincoln, as always, had a good imagination in mind, and it was Lincoln who decided that we'll go with Erickson's plan for this turret. It looked and was called a cheese box on a raft. And so Monitor arrives. Monitor was a name that Erickson chose because his vessel, he said, would be a monitor to the Confederacy. And so Monitor shows up to engage CSS Virginia in a rollicking sea battle, or shall we say a calm water sea battle, in which the two blast at one another. Solid shot, there's no exploding shot. Solid shot is used. They blast and blast. Each one does damage to the other, but not enough to win the battle. And so they both withdraw after the day's battle. I might say here, just as a sidebar, in writing naval history, this to me is a pivotal moment. Not for some of the obvious reasons of combat and war, but also for the lives, conditions of the men serving in the Navy. Imagine if you were a senior officer or a senior enlisted man in the early days of the Civil War, 1862, and you had served your career on sailing vessels. You had gone aloft, you'd been on the deck, you'd seen the world, everything that you saw, you felt the spray, the storms. Now, suddenly, your world is inside an iron box, a completely iron box. And it's dark and it's noisy. One of the things that happens in the Monitor is as Virginia's solid shot hits her side, rivets on the inside pop out. And so one of the dangers inside there was rivets flying around. And the heat, 120, 130 degrees inside. Ventilation systems were completely inadequate. So this changed a lot, not only combat, but it changed the world of the sailor as well. Must be time. The engagement between the Monitor and the Merrimack, as it is always called, was one that was more or less a draw. But Merrimack's future was dim. It wasn't because of a defeat by Monitor, but the Army was closing in on Norfolk. They tried to escape. They tried to bring Merrimack up the James River, but one of her faults was that she had a very deep draft. And she drew almost 30 feet of water. And so as they brought her up the river, it was impossible to get her very far up. And so Merrimack ended her life being blown up by the Confederacy. As for Monitor, she too suffered an ill fate. She might have been a powerful weapon at war, but she was a very poor seaboat. The difficulty with Monitor is she had very little freeboard. There probably wasn't much more than 18 inches of freeboard. And they tried to tow her down to South Carolina to participate in the attack on Charleston. And as they towed her down off Cape Hatteras, she was overwhelmed by the seas. She simply couldn't handle a heavy sea, and she went down. Since that time, of course, She has been found, the wreck has been found. Her turret has been brought up and is now undergoing long-term restoration at Newport News. But Monitor and Monitors more will be built. With good vessels for blockade and inshore, but they're very poor sea roads. In their continuing quest to establish the blockade, the Union turned its attention to capturing other forts. Fort Pulaski at the mouth of the Savannah River was taken by the Union, but not Savannah. So Savannah as a port remained open for the runners, blockade runners, but the fort at the end was now closed. This is Charleston Harbor. It is a very well-defended harbor, has a relatively narrow entrance, then broadens out, and right almost in the middle of the harbor, of course, is Fort Sumter. Well, the Confederates, after Fort Sumter fell, erected fortifications all around Charleston Harbor. It was very, very heavily fortified. And the Union now is laying siege to Charleston, naval siege to Charleston. But no matter what they did, it survived. Here you see a lone Confederate sentry standing there. The Union blockaders would come by as close as they could get, bombard the forts, and in the morning, the Confederate flag, the stars and bars, would still be there. Charleston survived. A major attack, 1863, was launched on the port under the command of Admiral DuPont. Admiral DuPont, we know a good deal about his career in the Civil War. He wrote frequently to his wife. His letters have been published, and the correspondence between the admiral and his wife was quite remarkable. Frank, as she called him, wrote to her often, telling him what was going on, and particularly his frustration. His flagship was the steamship Wabash. Here you see her, steam frigate. That was his command vessel. She's a wooden vessel. The advance against Charleston left New York Harbor, and it was hardly a secret. Newspapermen were there. Everyone came out to see DuPont's fleet leaving for the attack of Charleston. So the Confederates had plenty of time to prepare themselves. And so now DuPont begins this naval assault. And here you see an attack, Union monitors. Here in the foreground is a different kind of Union ironclad. She is new Ironsides, named for old Ironsides. And she was built on a conventional frame of a ship and then plated over with guns. The monitors are here, and they were coming down in great numbers. The Union Navy was building them more and more. And the monitors, with their very large Dahlgren guns, were now bombarding the Confederates. It didn't work. The Confederates were able to hold up. There was one particular battle in this siege of Charleston that does stand out. This is Battery Wagner. Charleston in the distance. You can see the monitors here. Here at the tip of this peninsula was a Confederate battery known as Battery Wagner. Battery Wagner was a thorn in the side, as you can imagine. From this position, she was able to fire at the Union vessels. And so the order was given to the Army to take Battery Wagner. The Battery Wagner was well fortified. This is a photograph of her after she was taken. The fortifications are rather reminiscent of those of World War I. And the task of taking Battery Wagner was given to the Massachusetts 54th Infantry. Massachusetts 54th Infantry was an all-colored infantry regiment. The governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, John A. Andrew, had been a radical abolitionist before the war. When the war broke out, he pressured President Lincoln to raise black troops, combat troops. Lincoln wasn't in favor of that and did not want to do that for fear of antagonizing the Confederates. But after the Emancipation Proclamation, after the battle at Antietam, Lincoln consented to the raising of black troops. And the 54th Massachusetts was the first of the regiments raised. And it was the task now of the 54th Massachusetts to take Battery Wagner. This is Sergeant Kearney, who was the color sergeant in 54th Massachusetts. He won the Congressional Medal of Honor for the battle at Battery Wagner, the first African American to win that. The regiment, while made up of black troops, was commanded by white officers, and the commander was Colonel Robert Shaw, this young Boston Browner. The 54th Massachusetts assaulted Battery Wagner, took horrible casualties, was turned back, and among those who died at the assault was Colonel Shaw himself. Shaw's balance effort and the effort of the African-American troops there at Battery Wagner, of course, is commemorated with, I would suggest to you, perhaps the greatest Civil War memorial, the Shaw Memorial, which stands on Boston Common, showing Colonel Shaw with his black troops marching off to battle. Well, Battery Wagner stood. It would eventually, of course, be captured, but that didn't solve the problem of taking Charleston. But there she was, defiant, defiant, defiant. Charleston will stand. In the end, by the way, Charleston will be taken, but she will be taken by the Union Army, not by the Union Navy. As the Confederates sought ways to block the blockade, to destroy the blockade, they also used what they called torpedoes, what we would more likely call mines. These are weapons that wait. They just sit there underwater and they just wait for you. And the advantage to mines is not only the destruction that they can do, but also the terror that they inflict. You can imagine a lookout up forward on a Union blockading vessel trying to make it into some port or river or bay, the lookout calling out, "Mine ahead!" Suddenly everything stops and we go into reverse as quickly as possible. So that even when mines didn't actually work, and they often didn't work, their simple presence gave a feel of terror that sent away Union blockaders. They also used, the Confederates also used what we might call torpedo boats. These were not submarines, but torpedo boats. These were boats that had a long spar in the bow. And at the end of that spar was an explosive device. Now, the plan, and this was to get this vessel out and attack a Union blockader. She sat very low in the water, not a submarine, but very low in the water. And the idea was to get her close, to hit the side of a wooden vessel with this spar, to stick that explosive device, hopefully, into the side of the wooden vessel, then to back off and explode the device. Well, it didn't always work. And on occasion, the backing off didn't work, but the explosion did. And then perhaps the spar torpedo in a carrier would go down as well. Dangerous, very dangerous. Then, of course, the submarine, the Hundley. Really it is the first successful submarine. It's the first submarine to actually sink an enemy combatant. And here you see her, screw-driven. There's the spar out front. She was propelled in a rather intriguing way. You can see inside, obviously could not use steam propulsion in a submarine. And so there was a long crankshaft, and inside, about a dozen men on that crankshaft, turning the crankshaft, which would then turn the propeller at the end. They kept a candle inside to see how the oxygen level was. You can imagine 10, 12 men on that crank trying to move this vessel out. She was delivered by railroad to Charleston to attempt an attack on the Union blockading fleet. And on February 17th, 1864, the Hundley attacked the USS Housatonic and sank the Housatonic. She also sank herself. She went down with the Housatonic. It's likely that that spar torpedo didn't disengage for whatever reason. She went down. The Hundley does, though, deserve the recognition as being the first submarine to successfully sink an enemy combatant. Like the turret of the Monitor, the Hundley had been found and recovered, and here she is, undergoing restoration. When you raise a vessel up, when she's been down for a long period of time, you simply don't raise her up and let her dry out. That doesn't work very well because she'll deteriorate very quickly. So what has to happen when these vessels are brought out is a very long, years it takes to gradually and carefully see to her restoration. So she will be under restoration now for some time as they are now in the process of restoring her hull. The blockade along the Atlantic coast came to its culmination really in January of 1865 when Fort Fisher was taken. Fort Fisher was the fort defending the approaches to Wilmington, North Carolina. Fort Fisher was a very large fort, sand fort, held by the Confederates that kept the Union blockaders at a distance, making Wilmington the last really successful port, open port, of any hope for Confederate raiders to make it. The assault on Fort Fisher was an enormous undertaking, one of the largest naval expeditions ever undertaken. And here you can see the fleet, the Union fleet, offshore bombarding Fort Fisher in this continuous, huge bombardment. The bombardment did in fact wreak havoc. It was so heavy. And finally, after the bombardment, the Union landed troops, and Fort Fisher, January 1865, was taken. The fall of Fort Fisher really culminates the blockade there along the Atlantic coast. Now, the coast is in fact sealed. I might mention that Charleston, of course, fell to General Sherman's army at the very end of 1864. So the Atlantic coast was sealed off. There still remained, though, and continuous and parallel to the efforts along the Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast, in particular, of course, the Mississippi, the father of waters, a vital artery for the Confederacy, and New Orleans being a vital port for the Confederacy. But in April of 1862, Admiral Farragut's fleet ran the forts at the mouth of the Mississippi River, and New Orleans was taken. The seizure of New Orleans, the rest of the Mississippi, or a good part of the Mississippi, was still in Confederate hands, but the seizure of New Orleans sealed off that port. The South's most important port was now in Union hands. A little bit to the east, another port that remained in Confederate hands for some time was Mobile. It sits at the head of Mobile Bay. The entrance to Mobile Bay is a rather narrow passage, and again it was a Union hope to seize Mobile, which they would not do, but to seize, at least to blockade and take the entrance to the port, which was assigned to Admiral David Glasgow Farragut. It was Farragut's task to run the forts and to get into Mobile Bay. It is and was a narrow channel into Mobile Bay, and a channel that had been mined, so there were torpedoes in the area. And the Union, Farragut, the intelligence was good. He was well aware that the torpedoes were there. The plan was for the Union fleet to proceed into the bay in column, with the ironclads running parallel and these large Union steam frigates in the center. The flagship, USS Hartford. It was initially Farragut's intention that he, as commander, would take the van in the USS Hartford, but his subordinate officers persuaded him that that was too risky for the commander. He should not be in the van. And so the van was given over to the USS Brooklyn. It was imperative, as Farragut instructed his captains, that no one deviate from the column. They must stay in the column. Should they deviate from the column, the danger was that they would hit a mine, a torpedo, and would then block the rest of the column, which would be a complete disaster. So they had to stay in column and continue forward. As they entered the passage, the gunfire, this is the age of black powder, the gunfire created a complete cloud just a cloud of gun smoke. You couldn't see anything. And so Farragut went into the rigging. In fact, they tied him in the rigging so that he could see over the smoke. As the Hartford, his flagship, was proceeding up, he saw in front of him something that startled him, gave him great distress. The Brooklyn was veering out of the channel. Her captain had seen a mine ahead and was trying to avoid it. Farragut was astonished, and he immediately ordered, in the apocryphal words, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." They came back into line and went through. Gratefully, although they did lose one vessel, what happened is that the mines, these torpedoes, were not very reliable. And you can imagine the men on board the USS Hartford, the USS Brooklyn, as they stood on deck, and in the midst of this gunfire, they could actually hear the throbbing noise of torpedoes hitting their hull and not exploding. And so Farragut's fleet then made it into Mobile Bay. There in Mobile Bay, they were met by Old Buck. This is Franklin Buchanan. Before the war, Franklin Buchanan had been the superintendent of the United States Naval Academy. He was one of the naval officers, U.S. naval officers, who went south. About 25% of Union Navy officers went south, which is about the same percentage as Union Army officers. So roughly a quarter of the officers. And Frank, Old Buck, as he was called, was one of those. Old Buck had command of the CSS Tennessee. This was a forlorn hope. Farragut's fleet vastly outnumbered what the Confederates had. But Buchanan was determined to make a show. And so out of this gunsmoke comes steaming down at the Union fleet, the CSS Tennessee. She is virtually surrounded by Union gunboats, ironclads, and frigates. And she is destroyed. She sinks to the bottom of Mobile Bay. The blockade, the action of the blockade, often caused certain kinds of diplomatic tangles for the Union. And the man in charge of untangling the diplomatic tangles that the Navy sometimes created was William Henry Seward, the Secretary of State. In November of 1861, a very serious event occurred on the high seas. Commodore Wilkes, Charles Wilkes, the same man who had commanded the exploring expedition in the 1840s, was in command of the steam frigate USS San Jacinto. Wilkes knew from intelligence that a British steamer, the Trent, had on board two Confederate diplomats, James Mason and John Slidell. Mason and Slidell were on their way to England to represent the Confederacy. Wilkes and San Jacinto stopped Trent, a British vessel, on the high seas. He boarded her and took Mason and Slidell off. Well, these two diplomats had now been taken off a British ship on the high seas by an American warship. It was a cause for war. The British were outraged, and did indeed, there was talk in Parliament of war. At this particular moment, there was also some sympathy with the Confederacy, but that will wear off as the war goes on. There was some sympathy. So here was an incident that feared now to turn to real engagement. Seward, a rather clever diplomat, managed to get us out of this tangle. First, by releasing Mason and Slidell. Mason and Slidell had been imprisoned in Boston. So Mason and Slidell were released and allowed to continue on their voyage. He then announced that Commodore Wilkes, Commander Wilkes, had gone beyond his orders, that he had acted without orders, and apologized to the British for that. Not everyone was happy. Here you see a cartoon that appeared in some newspapers, and it shows over here John Bull, the English Prime Minister, as if he's been beaten, and over here Seward, as if he's been beaten. So both sides thought they lost, which probably meant that it was a pretty good deal. And so this very serious diplomatic entanglement that might have brought us to war with the British was solved. The other problem that bedeviled the Union, the diplomatic problem, was the role of Confederate high seas raiders. Again, the Confederacy did not have the capacity to build a navy. But in any war, a weak power is likely to turn to some kind of commerce raiding, whether it be on the surface or in more recent times, submarine warfare. It is a warfare that is on the edge of international law, is often troublesome, and it certainly was so in the Civil War. The Confederate raiders were successful. This is the Confederate raider Nashville, the one I showed you escaping earlier. And here she is burning the American clipper ship, the Harvey Birch. These Confederate raiders either sank, captured these vessels, but the problem with raiding is you can't go home again. That once these raiders went to sea, it was very, very difficult for them to ever return home because of the blockade. So it wasn't, in a sense, a one-way trip out. They did great damage. Among the most notable Confederate captains was Raphael Semmes from Alabama, a rascal, a real rascal. He had served in the United States Navy. He'd been in the war with Mexico. He had also served in the United States Coast Survey. So he was an experienced naval officer, one who went south. Semmes commanded the most famous of the Confederate raiders. She was the Alabama. The Alabama was built in England. She was built in the yard, the Laird yard in Birkenhead on the Mersey River. Birkenhead is right across the river from Liverpool. She was built ostensibly as a commercial vessel. The man in charge of her building, watching over her building, the Confederate agent, was a man named Bullock. Perhaps a name lost in history to some degree, but he happens to have been Teddy Roosevelt's uncle. Mr. Bullock, the Confederate agent, was watching the construction of the Alabama. And again, there was this subterfuge that she was just being built. In the meantime, the American minister to Great Britain, Charles Francis Adams, was doing everything he could. It's a story of sabotage, spying, backstabbing, secret messages that goes on while she's Alabama, yet to be named, right, is undergoing construction. She's finally ready for sea. They announced they're going to have a maiden voyage just out of Liverpool, out of the Mersey River, just a day's sail, just to go out and enjoy, bring refreshments, you know. And so she sails out of the Mersey River, gets a little bit offshore. Captain Semmes sends everybody, all the visitors are sent over the side, sent ashore. Alabama hoists sail, hoists the stars and bars, and sets out on the Atlantic. She meets a supply ship, is supplied now with cannon, guns, ammunition. Most of her crew are British. Most of Alabama's crew are British seamen. And she's now on her way to a rampage. And it is a rampage. Alabama will sail in almost every ocean. And even those oceans she doesn't sail in, she's seen. She's the ghost. She's everywhere. She will take something in the nature of 60 Union vessels. She is everywhere. Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, is under heavy pressure to find her, destroy her. And this, of course, is exactly one of the things the Confederacy wanted, to draw Union Navy forces away from the blockade to search for Alabama. And you can imagine how difficult, with an aid for radar, reconnaissance, drones, how difficult it will be. But Alabama and Semmes has a problem. She is a belligerent vessel, and by international law, she can only put into a neutral port if she's in danger, and if she goes into a neutral port, she may only remain long enough to take on enough coal so that she can reach the next port. She cannot resupply beyond that. She cannot take in men. She cannot take on ammunition. And so Alabama is a bit of an orphan out there. She's also cannot go into a yacht to be refitted. Her engines are groaning. Her bottom is filthy. She's in a rather desperate situation. And so Semmes takes her up to Cherbourg in France. As soon as she gets into Cherbourg, the telegraph lines are ringing. It so happens at the time that in Rotterdam, the United States frigate Kearsarge is there under the command of Commodore Captain Winslow. As soon as Winslow gets notification, Alabama is in Cherbourg, he races down to Cherbourg. Here is Captain Winslow in the middle, and the crew of the USS Kearsarge. Kearsarge, by the way, is a new frigate. Relatively new, she's only been in the water about a year, so she's prime. Kearsarge races to Cherbourg. In the meantime, Alabama, under international law and by the command of the French, must leave Cherbourg. As Alabama departs Cherbourg, a French Navy band strikes up Dixie. She sails out, and then Semmes delivers a speech, a rousing speech to his crew. telling them in a kind of ironic way, you are sailing in the waters of John Paul Jones. And so Kearsarge, Alabama now is set for battle. It's really not a fair fight. Kearsarge is faster, she's newer, but Alabama's rather tired. The battle lasts not very long. Alabama goes down, her remains too have been found. A good part of the crew escapes. Ironically, there's a British yacht just kind of hovering in the distance, apparently a Confederate sympathizer, the Deerhound is her name. And when Alabama goes down, the Deerhound comes in to save most of the crew, including Captain Sims. They go off to England to be later repatriated with all harm is done. And so the Union Navy then tasked with chasing down and finding these Confederate raiders. At the very end of the war, just a few days before Appomattox, and not too many days before Lincoln's own death, Lincoln went down to the James River, and he met with his commanders, the men who had commanded him to help him win the Civil War. And there, in this iconic portrait painting by J.L.G. Ferris, you see the men who commanded the Union forces in the Civil War. There is Lincoln in the center in a thoughtful kind of pose. Then to his right, General Sherman, and then directly opposite, General Grant. And there to his left, representing the Navy and its role that it had played in winning the war, is Admiral Porter. And so the Navy had done its job, and the Union Navy had indeed helped to win the Civil War. Thank you all very much. I guess we have time for questions. What? Do we have time for questions? I always take easy ones. Way in the back, please.
You were saying the figures for the blockade.
Yeah.
The number of ships. Was that the total number of ships you tried to do something important?
That's a very good question. And the fact of the matter is, when you look at studies of the blockade, the numbers aren't good. No one was standing around keeping statistics. Those, I think I gave the source up there. Those are the numbers that appeared in a very good scholarly article in 2011, North Carolina Historical Review. Those are the numbers those two scholars came up with. And they came up with those numbers by using the numbers of many other sources. And so I wouldn't stand completely on those numbers. My simple point was this. The number of vessels captured and destroyed is interesting. What is more interesting to me is the total number of vessels trying to get in. And that's why I think we misjudged the Union blockade. It's often criticized because they didn't catch all the blockade runners. Absolutely true. But what the blockade really did was put up a stop sign and said, stay away.
I mean, that's if there's only like 200 or 300 ships are trying to get in, and trying to get into Southern Port, that's ridiculously enough.
What do you mean ridiculous?
And what had been before? That was
Oh yes, oh absolutely. Oh sure, absolutely. That's the point. Yes, that's the point. Right. Exactly. Yes, please.
Wasn't there a ship that continued to raise for a year after the war?
Yes, there was a vessel. One of those vessels didn't get the word, that the war was over. Continued to attack whaling vessels in the Pacific, particularly in the North Pacific. When they found out, one of the vessels they took, there was a newspaper that said the war's over. They were very concerned, by the way, very concerned that they would be treated as pirates because they had captured after them. So they threw their guns over and beeline for Liverpool. Went to Liverpool and managed to reach Liverpool. Yes. So can't remember exactly. End of 65. It was November 6, 1865. Thank you. Yes. But they were concerned about being treated as pirates. Yes. Sir.
You mentioned at the beginning that Kennedy did not call the other ships back to the squad. How long would it have taken for him to say the African squadron and the Joe squadron to get the word to them and for them to have gotten back?
Question is, how long would it have taken to get the word to the distant squadrons to come home? Well, it certainly would have taken months. But the point is, the orders were issued. So from the time of Lincoln's election in November, South Carolina secession descent. Orders, well, judgment, opinion. It would seem to me that the Secretary of Navy should have been issuing orders to recall the ships. Those orders were not issued. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that the monitors saying that they take the high seas, yet you built a number of other monitors for serving. How did they keep them in that phase as close to comfort?
Yes, they did keep them close to, well, close to shore, yes. They were not sent overseas to the high seas. Monitors, again, because of the very low freeboard, were not good sea vessels. Yes, and back again, please.
After the war, how many ships were shooting some place after the war?
I'm sorry?
How many was the trade after? How many was the trade after the war? Like how many ships went to Southern
You mean what happened to the Union Navy after the war?
Not southern ports.
After the war, how many ships went after the war?
I'm sorry, sir.
How much trade affected in the southern ports after the war? Did it take a while to come back? Trade.
The trade. Certainly the trade. I mean, the South had to recover its reconstruction. South had to recover, but certainly New Orleans, yes, the ports all recovered. And the Mississippi, New Orleans, of course, becomes the great port of the Mississippi, yes. All those ports do recover. But as the South recovers in the period of reconstruction. Yes, please.
Yes, wasn't the U.S. Navy at the beginning of the war handicapped by lack of flight rank officers?
Question is, was the Navy handicapped by lack of flag ranked officers? It's hard for me to imagine being handicapped by a lack. We seem to have overcome that, by the way. No, not really. It was a small Navy. There were no admirals. There were no flag ranked admirals, no flags, before the Civil War. This 42 to 43 ships. There was nothing to command. They had commodores. Just a little technical point. Commodore at this time period was not an official rank. Commodore was if there were a number of ships present, the senior captain was referred to as the Commodore. Okay? So that was the highest rank. But the fleet wasn't large enough to warrant an admiral. Yes, please.
Did the coast of California see much action during the war?
No. California didn't see any action. No. It was simply. Just couldn't get there. I mean, what would be the point? There was nothing there to, no Californians here. I mean, there was nothing there to worry about. Well, you've all been very, very kind. Thank you very much.